What if I told you that in some corners of England, love was never the currency that mattered? In the year 1814, in a world where beauty could be traded like stock and wealth measured like grain, there existed a code so absolute, so brutally honest, that it made even the coldest marriage mart seem romantic by comparison. They called it the Fair Exchange, and in the grey, forgotten district of Ashenall, one woman was about to discover that her face was worth more than gold, but only if she could find a buyer before time ran out. Her name was Ilara Thornwood, and she was the wealthiest person in the poorest quarter of London. Not wealthy in coin, mind you, but in something far more valuable in the economy of flesh and fortune that governed her world. She was beautiful, devastatingly, impossibly beautiful, the kind of beauty that made merchants stumble over their words and ladies clutch their husbands a little tighter. Every morning she rose before dawn in the cramped room she shared with her sister Leela, and she invested 2 hours before the cracked mirror, perfecting the arch of her brow, the rose of her cheek, the gleam of her dark hair. While other girls in Ashenhall scrubbed floors or mended stockings, Ilara understood something they didn't. Her face was capital, and every moment spent enhancing it was compound interest on her future. The neighbours whispered, of course, they always did. "Look at her," the washerwomen would mutter as Ilara glided past in her carefully mended gown, posture perfect despite the mud beneath her feet. "Acts like a duchess when her father can't even pay the rent." But Ilara knew what they couldn't see. She wasn't acting, she was preparing for the only transaction that could save her family from the gutters they were circling, like water down a drain. You see, in this world, there were laws as immutable as gravity. A man's worth was measured in his ledgers, a woman's in her looking-glass, and the greatest sin, the unforgivable crime that society could never pardon, was theft. Not the theft of jewels or coin, but something far more insidious, the theft of an unequal exchange. Ilara had seen it happen. Pretty girls who gave themselves to penniless poets, expecting love to fill their bellies. Handsome rogues who seduced wealthy widows, draining their coffers with promises of passion. These people, these market disruptors, who refused to pay the fair price, were scorned by high society with a venom reserved for the truly dangerous. The elite had names for them. Playboys, those men who sought pleasure without paying it in gold. Slay queens, those women who demanded wealth without offering beauty in return. Both were considered thieves of the worst sort, stealing what they hadn't earned, upsetting the delicate balance that kept society from collapsing into chaos. Ilara's father was one such thief, though she loved him despite it. Marcus Thornwood had committed the cardinal sin 25 years ago, when he'd married Ilara's mother, a woman so beautiful she'd had earls and viscounts competing for her hand. But Marcus had been poor then, poor as church mice, and he'd convinced her that love was worth more than fortune. For a while, perhaps it was, but love doesn't pay the landlord. Love doesn't buy medicine when fever strikes. Love doesn't keep the cold from seeping through broken window panes. Ilara's mother had died young, her beauty wasted on poverty, her life a cautionary tale whispered in every drawing-room from Mayfair to Bath, the beautiful woman who married down and paid for it with everything she had. Now, 16 years later, Marcus Thornwood was reaping what he'd sown. The debt collectors had come 3 times in as many weeks, and last Tuesday they'd brought an eviction notice. 30 days to settle accounts or surrender the house. 30 days before Ilara and Leela would be on the streets, their beauty dimmed by desperation, their market value plummeting like bad investments in a panic. Ilara had lain awake that night, her heart pounding with the arithmetic of survival. She was 22 years old, prime marrying age, but dangerously close to being labelled a spinster. Her beauty, her only asset, was at its peak valuation, but beauty without access to the right marketplace was like having a fortune locked in a vault with no key. That's when the invitation arrived. Heavy cream paper, sealed with silver wax, delivered by a footman in livery that probably cost more than everything Ilara owned combined. The Solstice Gala at Kensington House, the ultimate marketplace where England's wealthiest men paraded like peacocks and eligible ladies displayed themselves like diamonds in a jeweller's window. Ilara stared at that invitation for a full minute, her hands trembling. She knew exactly what it was, her chance, her one chance to liquidate her assets before they depreciated beyond recovery. But there was a problem. To attend such an event required more than an invitation. It required a gown that didn't look like it had been turned 3 times and let out twice. It required jewellery that didn't turn your neck green. It required the trappings of wealth to attract wealth, the oldest contradiction in the marketplace of marriage. What Ilara did next would have horrified her father if he'd known. She took her mother's wedding ring, the only thing of value left in their house, the only inheritance she had besides her cheekbones, and she sold it, not for coin to pay the rent, but for a gown, ice blue silk that shimmered like water in moonlight, cut low enough to showcase what God had given her, modest enough to prove she wasn't giving it away for free. She borrowed pearl earrings from a former lady's maid who owed her family a favour. She practised her curtsy until her knees ached, and her smile until it looked effortless, because she understood the game better than anyone. She wasn't going to the Solstice Gala to find love, she was going to make a trade. Her body, her beauty, her ability to produce beautiful children in exchange for a man's wealth, his status, his ability to provide security. It wasn't robbery, it wasn't prostitution, it was the most honest transaction in all of England, the fair exchange. And then she saw him. Duke Julian stood at the top of the grand staircase of Kensington House like a monument to accumulated wealth. He wasn't handsome, not in the way of the stable boys and soldiers that made girls giggle. His features were ordinary, almost plain, but he didn't need a handsome face because he wore something far more dazzling: power. Pure, unfiltered, generational power that made the very air around him shimmer with possibility. When he entered the ballroom, 300 people holding champagne flutes worth more than Ilara's house collectively held their breath. This was a man who could buy anything, anything except the one thing Ilara possessed, beauty so profound that it could elevate his ordinary features, beauty that would ensure his children escaped his plainness, beauty that would make his dynasty legendary instead of merely rich. Their eyes met across the ballroom, and Ilara felt it, the recognition. 2 titans of equal net worth finally finding their match in the marketplace of marriage. She didn't smile coyly or look away. She held his gaze with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was worth and exactly what she was owed. This wasn't the beginning of a love story. This was the opening bid in the negotiation that would determine whether she died young and poor like her mother, or whether she finally balanced the account that had been in deficit since the day her father stole her mother's beauty for free. But here's what neither of them knew yet. Someone else was watching. Someone who believed he could undercut the Duke's offer, who thought the rules of fair exchange didn't apply to him, who was about to turn their simple transaction into something far more dangerous. The question isn't whether Ilara will marry the Duke. The question is, when the market becomes volatile and everyone wants to steal what they haven't earned, can anyone truly afford the fair price, or will greed corrupt even the most honest exchange? The very next morning, a carriage bearing the royal crest arrived at the crumbling Thornwood residence, and Alara knew the negotiation had begun. Not with flowers or poetry, mind you, but with something far more valuable, an invitation to the Grand Library at St. James's Palace, a place where only serious contenders for power were allowed to tread. The message was clear. Duke Julian wasn't courting her, he was vetting her, and in the ruthless economy of the fair exchange, due diligence was the sincerest form of flattery. Alara arrived in that same borrowed gown, now pressed and perfumed within an inch of its life, but she carried herself like she owned the palace itself. Because here's what most people misunderstood about beauty. It wasn't just about the face you were born with. It was about the absolute conviction that you deserved everything that face could buy you. When she entered the Grand Library, Julian was waiting, standing before a window that framed him in winter light, making his ordinary features look almost regal. Almost. He turned, and for the first time she saw him smile. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who just discovered an asset was exactly as valuable as his appraisers had promised. "Miss Thornwood," he said, and his voice had the weight of inherited authority. "I've been reading about your mother, Lady Catherine Fairfax, before she married. They say she was the toast of 3 seasons. The dukes fought duels over her." He paused, letting the words hang in the air like a price tag. "Tell me, what does a man of limited means offer a woman of limitless duty to convince her to commit financial suicide?" It wasn't a romantic question, it was an audit, and Alara, brilliant Alara, didn't flinch. "Candor is all I can afford, Your Highness. Unlike some, I have no surplus to waste on pretty lies." And there it was, the foundation of their social merger. Not passion, not romance, but mutual recognition of value. Over the following weeks they met 7 times, not in ballrooms or gardens where chaperones could eavesdrop, but in places where business was conducted: the Grand Library, the Winter Gardens during parliamentary sessions, the Duke's private study where maps of his estates covered walls like trophies of conquest. Their conversations were unlike any courtship London society had seen. While other couples whispered sweet nothings, Ilara and Julian discussed portfolio theory. A man, at his best, is wealthy, stable, capable of providing not just for his wife, but for generations to come. This is his biological imperative, his evolutionary purpose, to build empires that outlast his flesh. Ilara nodded, adding, "And a woman, at her best, is beautiful, desirable, capable of producing offspring that inherit her aesthetic advantages. This is her gift to posterity, her genetic legacy." They spoke about marriage like generals planning a campaign, and to them it made perfect sense. Why shouldn't the 2 most honest people in England discuss the most important transaction of their lives with the same seriousness merchants used when trading ships and cargo? But while Ilara was building her future, her sister Leela was busy demolishing hers. It started innocently enough. Leela, sweet, foolish Leela, had taken to visiting the palace stables on the days Alara met with the Duke, and there, mucking out horse stalls and smelling of hay and leather, was a young man named Thomas Reed. He was handsome in that devastating way that made smart women stupid, all cheekbones and earnest eyes, and calloused hands that had never held anything more valuable than a bridle. Leela fell for him like a stone falls down a well, quickly, inevitably, and with no chance of retrieval. When Alara discovered them in the stable loft, Thomas's arm around Leela's waist, Leela's head on his shoulder, she felt something close to physical pain. "What are you doing?" Ilara hissed, dragging Leela outside, while Thomas stammered apologies. "Do you have any idea what you're throwing away?" Leela's eyes were bright with defiance, and something worse, hope. I'm not throwing anything away, Ilara. I'm choosing something real. He loves me. He's a stable boy. He's kind and he's honest and he makes me laugh. He's stealing from you." Ilara's voice cracked like a whip. "Don't you understand? You're beautiful, Leela, almost as beautiful as I am. That beauty is supposed to buy you security, comfort, a life where you never have to worry about where your next meal comes from. And you're giving it away to a man who can't even afford to keep his own horse, let alone a wife." But Leela shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks, and said the most dangerous thing a woman in their world could say. "Maybe I don't want to be bought." The words hung between them like a curse, because what Leela didn't understand, what she refused to see, was that in the world of the fair exchange, refusing to be bought was the same as choosing to be stolen from. There was no third option, no romantic middle ground where love conquered all. You either traded your beauty for security, or you wasted it on a man who couldn't afford you, and society would mock you for the bankruptcy that inevitably followed. Ilara had seen it happen to other girls, pretty daughters of poor families who married for love and ended up in workhouses, their beauty weathered by poverty, their children hungry and hollow-eyed. The fair exchange wasn't cruel, it was honest, and honesty, as anyone in business knew, was the only foundation upon which prosperity could be built. But Lila's rebellion was merely the first crack in Ilara's carefully constructed plan. The second came in the form of Duke Varric Ashton, a man who believed rules were suggestions meant for lesser mortals. He approached Ilara at the Opera House during a performance of Handel, sliding into the seat beside her while Julian was occupied in conversation with Parliament members. Varric was handsome where Julian was plain, charming where Julian was reserved, and twice as wealthy as he needed to be. "Miss Thornwood," he purred, his voice smooth as expensive brandy, "I've been watching your negotiations with interest. Tell me, has the Duke made you an acceptable offer yet?" Ilara stiffened. "I fail to see how that concerns you, Your Grace." "It concerns me because I can offer you something better, something the Duke, constrained by royal protocol and public scrutiny, cannot." He leaned closer, and she could smell bergamot and ambition. "Become my mistress. I'll settle a house on you in Belgravia, provide you with an allowance that would make most wives weep with envy, and ask for nothing in return except your company when I desire it. No marriage contract, no binding yourself to one man for life, just beauty exchanged for gold, as straightforward as any business transaction." The offer hung in the air like poison. Because here's what made it truly dangerous. It wasn't entirely unreasonable. Becoming a wealthy man's mistress was, in some circles, considered a legitimate career path for a beautiful woman of limited means. The kept woman, the protected paramour, living in luxury without the binding obligations of marriage. Some would argue it was better compensation than a loveless marriage, more honest than pretending vows meant anything beyond the contract they represented. But Ilara had watched her mother die young, branded a fool for marrying poor. She wouldn't be branded a whore for refusing to marry at all. "No," she said simply. Varric's smile didn't falter. "You're refusing free money, Miss Thornwood? How principled! Or is it that you believe the Duke's offer will be better? Let me assure you, his royal obligations will always come first. You'll be a wife in name, a broodmare in function, and a decoration in practice, whereas I would cherish you as the prize you are." "A prize with no legitimacy," Ilara said coldly. "A beautiful ornament to be replaced when age inevitably diminishes my value. At least as a duchess I secure not just my future, but my children's inheritance. Your offer is generous, Your Grace, but it's the financial equivalent of renting when I could own." Varric's eyes hardened, and in that moment Ilara saw the truth. He wasn't offering her security, he was offering her a test. He wanted to prove that even she, practical Ilara, who understood the fair exchange better than anyone, could be tempted by immediate gratification over long-term investment. He wanted to prove that all women were slay queens at heart, willing to take money they hadn't fairly earned through the legitimate contract of marriage. When she rejected him, she saw something worse than anger in his face. She saw determination, because men like Varric didn't accept no as a final answer. They saw it as an opening bid in a negotiation that would continue until they got what they wanted or destroyed what they couldn't have. The third blow came that very night, when Julian, her Julian, was approached by a woman that made Ilara's blood run cold. Lady Helena Pemberton was beautiful in the way that classical sculptures are beautiful, perfect, cold, and utterly available for the right price. She'd been married twice, widowed twice, and rumor had it both husbands had died smiling despite their inexplicably drained bank accounts. She was a slay queen of the highest order, a woman who had perfected the art of extracting maximum wealth for minimum commitment, and she wanted Julian. Ilara watched from across the ballroom as Helena placed her hand on Julian's arm, leaning close to whisper something that made him laugh. Actually laugh, something he rarely did in Ilara's presence. Helena wasn't offering him marriage, she was offering him something men were biologically programmed to want more than security or dynasty or any of the rational things Julian claimed to value. She was offering him pleasure without price, sexual availability without the binding contract of marriage, the fantasy every playboy chased, beauty without having to pay for it in gold. What if Julian decided he could have both, keep Ilara as his legitimate wife, mother of his heirs, while maintaining Helena as his mistress, the source of passion his practical marriage wouldn't provide? It happened all the time in their world. The French had even romanticized it, this idea that a man needed both the Madonna and the whore, the wife and the mistress, the woman who secured his dynasty and the woman who entertained his knights. But the fair exchange was built on exclusivity, Ilara's beauty in exchange for Julian's wealth, not Ilara's beauty plus Helena's availability in exchange for Julian's wealth divided between them. That wasn't fair, that was theft. And the question that kept Ilara awake that night, staring at the ceiling of her cramped room while her father snored, and Lila whispered Thomas's name in her sleep, was this: could any man, even a duke who claimed to understand the mathematics of exchange, resist the temptation of getting something for nothing? The answer came 3 weeks later with the force of a financial collapse. A scandal broke that shook London society like an earthquake. Someone, some anonymous gossip with nothing to lose and everything to gain from chaos, had published a pamphlet. It detailed Marcus Thornwood's history, laying bare his poverty in clinical detail. But worse, so much worse, it introduced a new term into the vocabulary of the fair exchange: the debtor to beauty. The pamphlet argued that Marcus hadn't just married above his station, he had infected his wife with poverty, draining her beauty through stress and deprivation until she died young, her aesthetic capital completely depleted. And now, the pamphlet claimed, Ilara carried that same infection. She might look valuable now, but she was from debtor stock. Her children would carry the stain of poverty in their blood, would revert to ugliness and failure no matter how much wealth was poured into them. Marrying Ilara wasn't an exchange, the pamphlet declared. It was charity. It was Julian paying full price for damaged goods. The effect was immediate and devastating. Invitations dried up overnight, whispers followed Ilara through the streets, and the worst of all, Julian's advisers descended on him like vultures on carrion, demanding he reconsider the match. Ilara learned all of this second-hand because Julian himself had stopped calling on her. 4 days passed with no word, then 5, then a week. Her father's eviction notice came due, and they had nowhere to go. Lila announced she was marrying Thomas Reed in a pauper's ceremony, throwing her beauty away on a man who couldn't afford to keep her in hairpins, let alone happiness. And Ilara, practical Ilara, who had never cried over circumstances she could control, found herself weeping in that cracked mirror where she had invested so many hours of maintenance. Because she'd done everything right. She understood the rules. She refused to steal and refused to be stolen from. She had found a man of equal value and negotiated in good faith. And still the market had turned against her. The question wasn't whether she'd been wrong about the fair exchange. The question was whether anyone, in a world where gossip could destroy reputations and rivals could undercut any offer, and men could be tempted by pleasure over principle, could ever truly complete an honest transaction. When Varick had offered her free money, she'd refused. When Helena had offered Julian free sex, had he been strong enough to do the same? Or had Ilara invested everything she had in a market that was rigged from the start, where the only people who profited were the ones willing to cheat? She was about to find out, because tomorrow night was the final royal ball of the season, and Ilara had one last chance to prove her value before the account closed permanently, leaving her bankrupt in a world that showed no mercy to those who couldn't pay their debts. Would Ilara even show up to the royal ball, knowing the entire court would be watching her humiliation? That was the question on everyone's lips as carriages rolled up to Buckingham Palace on that frost-kissed December evening. The scandal had done its work. She was ruined in every way that mattered to society. No invitations, no prospects, no future. Most women in her position would have fled to the countryside, hidden themselves away until the gossip found fresher meat to devour. But Ilara Thornwood had never been most women, and she understood something the scandalmongers didn't. The only thing worse than being talked about was being forgotten. She arrived late, deliberately late, in a gown that made her previous attire look like practice sketches before a masterpiece. This wasn't borrowed finery or carefully mended silk. This was devastating simplicity, white as fresh snow, cut to showcase every angle and curve that made her valuable. She'd sold everything left in her father's house to pay for it, the furniture, her mother's remaining jewelry, even the dishes they'd eaten from. This gown was her final liquidation, her last investment, and as she walked through those palace doors alone, without chaperone or family or any of the social armor other women carried, the ballroom fell silent. Not the comfortable silence of admiration, but the predatory silence of a crowd waiting to watch someone fall. Julian stood at the far end of the ballroom, surrounded by his advisers like a fortress of doubt. She could see it in his posture, the way he held himself rigid, uncertain. For 3 weeks he'd avoided her, let the scandal poison what they'd built, allowed other voices to overwrite his own judgment. And now, with 300 witnesses watching, Ilara had to do something no woman in the history of the fair exchange had ever successfully done. She had to prove her value, not through coy glances or tears or emotional manipulation, but with cold, undeniable mathematics. She didn't walk toward him, not yet. Instead, she moved to the center of the ballroom floor, that gleaming expanse of marble where dancers would soon spin in practiced formations, and she simply stood there, waiting. The crowd murmured, confused. What was she doing? Then, from somewhere in her carefully constructed composure, Ilara began to speak. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the quiet authority of someone presenting evidence to a jury. "Your Highness," she said, and her voice carried in the shocked silence, "I've been accused of fraud. The pamphlet claims I'm a debtor to beauty, that my value is compromised by my father's poverty, that any children I produce will inherit failure rather than grace. These are serious charges in a market built on trust, so let me address them with the same honesty that has defined our negotiations from the beginning." She turned slowly, making sure every person in that ballroom could see her face, could bear witness to what she was about to do. "3 months ago, when I first entered your world, no one knew my name. I was invisible despite my beauty, worthless despite my assets, because I had no access to the marketplace where value is properly recognized. But from the moment the Duke and I were seen together, something changed. Not in me, in him." She let that sink in before continuing. "Suddenly, the Duke, who was always described as plain, ordinary, unremarkable in appearance, was being called distinguished, regal. The society pages began praising his elegant bearing, his refined tastes, his natural authority. Nothing about him changed, except the woman standing beside him. I didn't diminish his value, I multiplied it." The advisers shifted uncomfortably, but Ilara wasn't finished. "The pamphlet speaks of infection, of poverty spreading like disease. But let's examine that claim through the lens of economics rather than fear. Yes, my father was poor when he married my mother, but my mother's beauty, rather than being destroyed by that poverty, produced me. And I, despite growing up in Ashenhall surrounded by deprivation, maintained and enhanced my aesthetic value through discipline and investment. If beauty could be so easily corrupted by circumstance, I would have lost it years ago. The fact that I didn't proves something the scandalmongers refuse to acknowledge. True value is resilient." Julian's face was unreadable, but she saw something shift in his eyes. Not love, she didn't need love, but something more important, recognition. Recognition that she was right, that the mathematics she was presenting was sound, that he'd been on the verge of making the worst business decision of his life by listening to advisers who understood neither beauty nor its proper valuation. But Ilara knew she needed to address the real question, the one everyone was thinking, but no one was saying. The concern, of course, is about children. Will they be beautiful? Will they be healthy? Will they carry forward the strengths of both parents or revert to some imagined baseline of failure? She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice held absolute certainty. "A wealthy man never has ugly children, Your Highness. Do you know why? Because wealth provides nutrition, healthcare, education, security, all the environmental factors that allow genetic potential to fully express itself. And a beautiful woman never has poor children, because beauty, when properly traded, secures the wealth that ensures prosperity. This isn't romantic fantasy, this is observable reality." She took 3 steps toward him, closing the distance between them with measured precision. "You asked me once what my father offered my mother to convince her to commit financial suicide. I told you he offered her an illusion, but here's what I'm offering you, reality. Not the illusion that I'll love you in the way poets describe, but the reality that I will honor our exchange, my beauty, my genetics, my ability to enhance your public image and produce heirs that will make your dynasty legendary, in exchange for your wealth, your protection, your ability to provide security that lasts beyond our lifetimes. This isn't charity, this isn't fraud. This is the fairest exchange anyone in this room will ever witness." The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the candles flickering in their sconces. And then, slowly, deliberately, Julian began to walk toward her. His advisers reached for him, tried to hold him back with whispered warnings about reputation and proper protocol, and the scandal that would surely intensify if he proceeded. But he shook them off with the authority of a man who'd finally remembered he was a duke, not a committee. When he reached Ilara, he didn't take her hand romantically. He extended his hand for a shake, the way businessmen sealed contracts, the way equals acknowledged mutual respect. "You're right," he said, loud enough for the entire court to hear. "I've been treating this as a risk when it's actually the soundest investment I could make. My advisors see your father's poverty as a liability. I see your rise from that poverty as proof of your value's durability. Any woman can maintain beauty and comfort. You've maintained it through hardship. That's not weakness. That's exceptional quality control." He turned to address the crowd, still holding her hand in that firm, businesslike grip. "Tomorrow I will transfer the deed to Thornwood Manor into Miss Ilara's name, along with an annual allowance of £10,000 to be hers regardless of whether our marriage proceeds. This is not a gift. This is payment for services already rendered. Since she's been seen with me, my approval ratings have increased by 23%. Marriage proposals to my cousins have tripled because suddenly the royal family is associated with beauty rather than merely power. She has already earned this compensation. The marriage contract will simply formalize our continued partnership." It wasn't a declaration of love. It wasn't even particularly romantic. But to Ilara, standing there in her final gown, having risked everything on one last negotiation, it was more valuable than any poetry could ever be. Because Julian understood. He understood that to be truly equal with her was to recognize her strength, not diminish it with empty flattery. He understood that his role was to provide financial security while she provided aesthetic and genetic security. He understood the fair exchange not as a cold transaction, but as the most honest foundation any partnership could have. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in Westminster Abbey, and something remarkable happened. No one, not a single society matron or newspaper columnist, accused Julian of marrying down, and no one congratulated Ilara on marrying up. Instead, the collective assessment was simple. The account is balanced. A woman of maximum beauty had married a man of maximum wealth, and the universe had returned to its proper equilibrium. At the reception, Ilara saw her sister Leela standing with Thomas Reed, both of them dressed in clothes they clearly couldn't afford, both of them glowing with something that looked dangerously like happiness. Ilara felt that familiar surge of protective fear, the certainty that Leela was heading for disaster. But then Thomas placed his hand on Leela's rounded belly, still small but visible if you knew where to look, and Leela smiled at him with such complete trust that Ilara had to look away. Maybe they would end up in poverty. Maybe their children would grow up hungry. Maybe Leela would die young like her mother, her beauty wasted on a man who couldn't afford to preserve it. Or maybe, just maybe, there were some transactions that couldn't be measured in pounds and pence, some exchanges that defied the mathematics Ilara had built her entire life around. But that was Leela's gamble to make. Ilara had made hers, and when Julian appeared at her side, pressing a glass of champagne into her hand with a small, satisfied smile, she knew she'd made the right one. 18 months later, she gave birth to a daughter. Perfect skin, her mother's eyes, her father's solid, healthy constitution. The child of a wealthy man and a beautiful woman, inheriting the best of both, exactly as the theory predicted. The cycle of poverty and ugliness broken through the simple, honest logic of the fair exchange. Some called it cold, some called it transactional, but Ilara called it what it truly was, fair. And in a world filled with thieves and frauds, with playboys seeking pleasure without payment, and slay queens demanding wealth without offering value, wasn't fairness the most radical position of all? So here's my question for you, because this story isn't really about Ilara and Julian, it's about the exchanges we all make every single day, whether we admit it or not. When you choose a partner, are you choosing based on what they can provide, or based on some romanticized fantasy that love conquers practical reality? When someone offers you something for nothing, do you recognize it as the theft it truly is? And most importantly, in a world that constantly tells us to follow our hearts and trust our feelings, is there something powerful, maybe even liberating, about being brutally honest about what we're trading and what we expect in return? Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me if you think Ilara was cold and calculating or smart and realistic. Tell me if you'd make the same choice she did, or if you'd follow Leela's path instead. And if this story made you think differently about relationships, marriage, and the things we trade for security, hit that like button and subscribe, because we're just getting started exploring the uncomfortable truths hiding beneath society's prettiest lies. The account is balanced, but is yours?